Welcome everyone. So happy to be learning with you as always. Today's class is a Hasid in medieval Garb, piety and popular religion in Ashkenaz and beyond, with Dr. Rachel Furst. Is that how you pronounce the last name? Furst. Okay. Just to quickly explain engagement. So I understand that Rachel would love to hear everyone's comments and questions during class. She wants it to be a engaging class. Feel free to accept my invitation that I'm sending to become a panelist. This will allow you to unmute and actually verbally ask questions and make comments. Or you can also participate during the class in the chat box by writing your comment or question, or if you're watching us live on Facebook, as a comment on Facebook as well. I will be monitoring the chat on Facebook so I can ask Rachel the questions directly. Just to kind of make sure we keep the class going smoothly with not a lot of background distracting noise, I just want to make sure that when you're not speaking, please make sure that you stay muted, and then simply unmute when you would like to actively participate in class. So just a few words about the class. This is Sefer Hasidim, 30th, sorry, Israeli here, century book of exegesis, I can't pronounce those words, exegesis, halakhah, narrative vignettes, and moral advice has fascinated and mystified generations of readers. Although the work is vivid in its deception of medieval life, it is unclear whether it represents a pietistic society that actually existed or simply the aspirations of a small elite group of ascetics. This is a hard description for an Israeli. Forgive me for butchering those words. In this course, we will examine the classic text with particular attention to its definitions of pious behavior and devout belief, as well as its prescriptions for shaping a virtuous society. And once again, I hope you were still able to understand all of those words. Just a few words about Rachel. Dr. Rachel Furst is a research fellow in medieval Jewish history at the University of Haifa, where she recently relocated from Munich, Germany. She holds academic degrees from Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Columbia University of New York, and has lectured widely in Israel, Europe, and in the United States. We're so happy to have Rachel with us. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rachel.
Great. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here teaching for Drisha. I have a long history of affiliation with Drisha, going all the way back to my years in high school. I must say, though, that this is my first time in the online format. So this is really a treat and a pleasure to be able to connect with all of you in this way. Especially as you heard now that I'm back in Israel. Since we're at least on Zoom, and at least for now, a relatively small group, I do want to reiterate that I am very, I will be very happy to make this an interactive and hopefully engaging class. This is the first of 8 sessions that we're going to have on this theme. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint presentation that I'll turn on momentarily, but I also told the people at Drisha that I will make the slides of the PowerPoint available after each session, so that although you don't have a source sheet in front of you on a per session basis, you'll certainly be able to refer back to the texts afterwards. And I'll do that today, and I'll do that in the future as well. As you heard, this class I titled A Hasid in Medieval Garb, and I called it Piety and Popular Religion in Ashkenaz and Beyond. And this fits in with one of the themes that Drisha is exploring this semester, that of piety. And I hope that that will become clear over the course of our discussion today and throughout the time. So let me begin by sharing my screen with you. Hold on just a moment while I get that up there. Okay, just one second while I get that into, excuse me. Okay, Okay, so I hope that you can now see the screen, and hopefully you can still continue to see me as well. Great. So we are going to today, as you can see on the screen right over here, we're going to begin with an introduction to the concept of piety and popular religion in the medieval period, and in particular in Ashkenaz, a bit of an introduction to Ashkenaz itself. And although I did not provide, I did not make a slide with a syllabus, which perhaps I should have done, and those of you who are interested, I can do so in future weeks. I did want to give you a little bit of a sense of where we'll be going in this course, even before we jump in. Today we're going to be introducing the topic, as I said, and particularly focusing on who was a Hasid in medieval Ashkenaz. What does that term mean? Who were the people that were meant by that term, who were included in that term? Next week, we're going to be delving into, on a week-by-week basis, different subtopics that will help us try and pinpoint what it meant to be a pious individual in this society. So next week, we'll be focusing on atonement and fasting. Next week we'll be starting our exploration with focusing on prayer. Then we'll be in the third week focusing on atonement and fasting. We'll be delving into attitudes toward the body and sexuality. We'll be talking about women and gender. We'll be talking about dress. We'll be talking about Jews and Christians. We'll be talking about attitudes toward the natural world. And finally, by the time we get to the 8th week of this course, we'll conclude by discussing the question of how Hasidei Ashkenaz and how the Jews of medieval Ashkenaz in general related to the question of elite piety versus mass or popular piety, sort of circling back and giving us a chance to pull together this topic. But before we begin, I want to talk about, I really want to sort of lay out the framework of the time and the place that we're going to be focusing on in this course, and to talk about what we mean when we say medieval Ashkenaz, for those who are perhaps not entirely familiar. What you see here in front of you now is a map, as the title indicates, of Jewish settlements in the German Reich, or the German Empire, around the year 1200. And this is coincides with roughly the beginning of the period that we'll be focusing on in our course. We are going to be, or I should say actually really the somewhere in the middle of the period that we're going to be focusing in on our course. When we talk about medieval Ashkenaz, we usually refer to, again, the Jews of the German-speaking lands. Some people refer to Ashkenaz a little bit more broadly and refer not only to the Jews of the German-speaking lands, but actually to the Jews of northern France and even England as well. Ashkenaz itself is a biblical word. In the Bible itself, it's not clear exactly which land it refers to, but something north of the land of Israel. But by the medieval period, by the time that we're discussing, it was used by Jews in this area to refer to themselves. It was initially used in a slightly broader sense, so perhaps it did include the Jews of northern France, who in many ways culturally were part of the same broader region. But over the course of the medieval period, and by the 13th century, it was a term that generally referred specifically to the Jews of the German-speaking lands of the medieval German Empire, and that's the sense in which I'm really going to be using it in this course. Now, when we speak of medieval Ashkenaz, medieval, as you may know, can have various beginning and end points as a period in history, but we are going to be focusing in on the 12th and 13th centuries, and that's why this map is fairly apropos. We're going to be focusing in on the 12th and 13th centuries, which was really kind of the, you could say, the High Middle Ages as far as the Jews of the medieval of the German-speaking lands were concerned. You can see here some of the settlements that were already settled by Jews by the year 1200. I don't have another map with me today. Perhaps I'll bring one in the future weeks to show you how this really exploded over the course of the 13th century, so that by the year 1300 or 1350, there would have been many more locations marked on this map. But you'll note that on the map itself, I circled or highlighted two particular areas. I see that there's a question. I'll take it in just a moment. Let me just finish my sentence. I highlighted two particular areas. One on the left or western side of the map is the larger circle that encompasses the towns of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, which in rabbinic texts and Jewish texts of the time were sometimes referred to as the Shum communities by their acronym Speyer, Worms, Mainz. The reason I circled these communities is not only because they were the heartland of Jewish settlement during the era, but because for our purposes in this course, as we begin to discuss a unique movement or a unique text known as Sefer Hasidim, and perhaps the Hasidei Ashkenaz who authored it, this was really the starting point of that sort of the cradle of creativity there. But as we're going to discuss, that movement really established itself in the second location that I highlighted here on the map in Regensburg, which at the time marked something of an eastern border to the German-speaking lands. You can see that they extend a bit further over, but for various purposes, that was something of an eastern border. Okay, I apologize. Now let's get to the question. Emily Labaton, I see that you raised your hand.
No, can you, what do you mean by high? High
When I said the high.
I've heard that term, but what does it mean in this context?
So for our purposes, we can just think of it as sort of like the height or the sort of the central, the most important period of the medieval era. There's sometimes historians will refer to the early Middle Ages, which usually runs, somewhere from around, I don't know, 500-600 of the Common Era through around the year 1000. That would be considered the early Middle Ages. The later Middle Ages would be considered the 1400s. So the 15th century would be considered the later Middle Ages. And the period in between, which corresponds roughly to the period, from Jewish purposes, to the period from around the First Crusade, which was in 1096, until the Black Death, which was in 1348, that period from about, again, 1096 to 1348, that roughly 250-year period, is what I meant when I referred to the Jewish High Middle Ages, which corresponds roughly to what historians outside of the Jewish realm would speak of as well as the central, or the Middle Ages that are neither the early ones nor the late ones. I hope that answered the question. Okay. So again, going back to our map here, the reason that I highlighted these two places is because we're going to see that they mark to a certain extent sort of the outer realms of the German-speaking lands and of the Jewish settlement in the German-speaking lands during the era, and they're particularly relevant for the work and the people that we're going to be discussing in this course. Okay. Now, the central figures who we are going to be focusing on, who are associated with the primary work that we're going to be talking about in this class in our discussion of what constituted piety and piousness in medieval Ashkenaz, are individuals who were known, sometimes referred to as Hasidim, associated with, I'm going to loosely call it a movement, although we're going to throw that into question in just a moment, known as Hasidei Ashkenaz. But here I want to take a step back for just a moment, and I want to note that Ashkenazi Jewry in general has been known for its piousness. It is a period, it is a geographic location that was associated with a particular brand of religiosity that in sort of classic Jewish historiography was oftentimes contrasted with what was assumed to be the looser and perhaps more secular, looser mores and more secular outlook of the other major medieval Jewish settlement, that of Spain or Sepharad. Now, in recent years, that contrast between pious Ashkenaz and more open or more secular Sepharad has been thrown into serious question. It has been demonstrated that many of the mores of Ashkenaz were in fact embraced by Sephardi or Spanish Jews as well. It has also been shown that many of the what were understood to be sort of rule-breaking tendencies of the Jews of Sepharad in fact found expression in Ashkenaz too, so that the dichotomy between Ashkenaz and Sepharad as being pious versus less so has been thrown into serious question, and that's also going to be something that we're going to be discussing. But I point that out as a general feature, facet that has been associated with Ashkenaz even before we get to the specific Hasidei Ashkenaz, the specific movement and the specific text, Sefer Hasidim, that we're going to be zooming in and focusing on in this course. Now, if we talk about, but now to say a word about this movement that I've been alluding to. So, Hasidei Ashkenaz are mentioned as such for the first time in texts from the 14th century. The concept of Hasid, which loosely translates as pious, is a term that we already, it appears in the Bible, but it also appears in the Talmud. The Talmud itself refers to Hasidim Rishonim, for example, to individuals who are known to have spent a particularly long time preparing for prayer, for example. And it uses that term to refer to individuals. As a matter of fact, I believe there's another course that is going to be talking about who were the Hasidim Rishonim, the Hasidim of the Talmudic period. But in other words, the term that was used in the medieval period was not a new term within the Jewish context. Nonetheless, we are going to be asking ourselves, when medieval people referred to Hasidim, who exactly were they talking about, or what, maybe is a better question, were they talking about? What characteristics, what features, what behaviors, what norms were associated with the concept of Hasid? And that's particularly acute because we're going to be, the text that is going to stand at the center of our study in this course is a book that is known as Sefer Hasidim, which has been translated occasionally as the book of the pious, and that is in fact the way that I would like to refer to it, but sometimes also as Sefer Hasidim, the book of the pietists. Now, that may not sound like a major difference in terminology, pious versus pietist, but I want to posit that in fact that is a significant difference that we should be paying attention to, because it basically raises the question of whether these Hasidim who are featured in the book of the pious were a formal movement that we could refer to as a pietist movement, or whether in fact this was a book that was simply spelling out or presenting a particular moralistic approach that was not meant for, or that did not represent a very formalized or institutionalized movement, but rather the norms and the mores of a much wider swath of the medieval Jewish Ashkenazi population. Now, the book itself has been affiliated with the three characters who you see on the screen in front of you. The first of whom, Shmuel ben Kalonymus Hasid, that's the way that he's referred to in contemporaneous sources, was born in Speyer sometime in the 12th century, died sometime in the second half of the 12th century. As his father's name Kalonymus indicates, he was a member of a very famous, very prominent Ashkenazi family, sometimes referred to as the Kalonymides, by the name of their most famous member. This family arrived in Ashkenaz sometime in the 9th century, probably from Italy, which is when where Jews, many of the Ashkenazi Jews, many of the Jews who settled in the German-speaking lands began to migrate north from. The Kalonymus family was centered in those Shum, in those Speyer, Mainz, Worms, Rhineland communities that I pointed out to you beforehand. His son, Yehuda ben Shmuel, also known as Hasid, was born in Speyer as well, but at some point during his life migrated eastward to Regensburg. And again, I'll just flip back for one moment to the map so that you can see what I'm talking about, right? This family, the authors of this work began in the heartland of Ashkenazi Jewry in the Rhineland, the Shum communities, and at some point migrated eastward to Regensburg. It is not entirely clear why they did so, nor is it entirely clear exactly when they did so. Traditionally, the assumption was that Yehuda, Rabbi Judah HaChasid, was the one who migrated to Regensburg. This has been challenged by some scholars recently who claim that perhaps it was a bit earlier, it was already his father who migrated eastward. As I mentioned, Regensburg marked one of the eastern borders of the German-speaking lands at the time, but it was by no means a backwater. It was a very important city already by the turn of the 13th century, by roughly the year 1200 when this migration must have taken place, or by the end of the 1100s when the migration is likely to have taken place. It was a seat of the empire at that point in time. It was a major trade center. You can see here a medieval depiction of that city. It was a walled city. It was a very well-established city by that point in time. And I want to also note that the Kalonymides, whether it was Shmuel or Yehuda, were by no means the first Jews, nor even the first rabbinic scholars in the town. So some theories about why they migrated, suggesting that their ideas were not accepted in their original Shum communities and they kind of wanted to reestablish themselves in a newer, less charted territory, have again been called into question by scholars because Regensburg did not quite match that description at the time. But in any event, Regensburg became the seat of this Hasidei Ashkenaz, again, movement, or perhaps a very small group of scholars that established itself at around this time. Yehuda ben Shmuel HaChasid of Speyer and then Regensburg, his most prominent student was Elazar ben Yehuda of Worms, the third figure that you see here. We know that Elazar ben Yehuda of Worms died before 1234, and we're going to actually come back to him. These three figures are the ones who are most closely associated with the Hasidei Ashkenaz group, as well as with the text known as Sefer Hasidim. Usually, traditionally, Rabbi Yehuda Hasid has been cast as the primary author of this work, but it is important to note that the work is anonymous, and more than the fact that the work is anonymous, the work, in fact, does not appear in one single recension or one single unified text. There are multiple different, distinct versions of Sefer Hasidim that exist already in medieval manuscripts, leading scholars to suggest that Sefer Hasidim, rather than If you can take a sort of contemporaneous medieval work like Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, which may be familiar to most of you, which was a very clearly individually authored text. Sefer Hasidim was not like Maimonides' Mishneh Torah in that way. It was more like the Talmud itself. That is a text that had multiple authors, that survived in multiple versions, that was probably compiled and then edited and re-edited by many students over the course of generations and maybe even centuries. So that it's very hard to speak of one distinct text, Sefer Hasidim. That being said, there is a core to Sefer Hasidim, which we're going to be focusing on, that does, although it is not entirely unified in its outlook and in its approach, that does bear distinct characteristics as a text. And again, the reason we're going to be focusing on this text is because it will be our window, our portal into this question of what was piety, what did piety mean to the Jews of medieval Ashkenaz. I want to say about this text that it's, again, we're going to get a chance already today to delve into some of its passages, so that I hope that by the end of our session today, you'll already have a bit of a better sense, a bit of a taste of what Sefer Hasidim reads like. It's hard to characterize it exactly, as my course description indicated. It's an ethical and moral work. It's also a work of halakhah. It's a master of storytelling. There are some wonderful vignettes in Sefer Hasidim, and it is so many other additional things as well. It's one of the richest sources for daily life in medieval Ashkenaz, one of our best entry points into understanding what life was like for the Jews of medieval Germany. But again, for our purposes, above all, it's also going to be the way that we're going to attempt to answer this question of what did piety mean. But one of the things that we're going to have to ask ourselves is whether Sefer Hasidim was the product of a very particular movement that saw themselves as promoting a very specific and distinct approach to life, to society, which is one of the ways that Sefer Hasidim has been traditionally understood, or whether Sefer Hasidim is in fact a broader reflection of a much wider, as I said earlier, swath of medieval Ashkenazi population. This over here, the slide that you see before you right now, is one of the, not the earliest printed edition, but one of the early printed editions. Sefer Hasidim was printed for the first time in the middle of the 16th century, in 1534. That edition, the Bologna edition, we'll get back to in just a moment. And it was reprinted many times thereafter, indicating that Sefer Hasidim had a very significant impact. It had a wide readership in the post-medieval period. And that's also a question that we're going to be asking ourselves in this course. Why did this book, how did this book speak to so many Jews after the lifetime of its authors, after the lifetime of the Jews to whom it was initially addressed? You can see up in the corner, let's see if this works. I wanted to show you what one of the medieval manuscripts of Sefer Hasidim looks like, but the images are not copyable, so I had to, we'll see if this works for me, to get you to the website where we can see it. I wasn't able to bring it into the slides, just a moment. Where we should be redirecting right now is to yes, here we go. This is the website of the National Library of Israel, which has quite a treasure trove of Jewish manuscripts of all varieties, from the medieval all the way through the modern periods. And you can see here, the image in front of you is of one of the most important Sefer Hasidim manuscripts, what is known as the Parma manuscript of Sefer Hasidim, which is considered to be one of the most complete versions of Sefer Hasidim. I'll try to zoom in so that you can see a little bit of the writing. This is from the beginning of the text, right? You can see a little bit. This manuscript is understood to have been from the late 13th or early 14th century, so around the year 1300, meaning it's a very early manuscript itself. And this is what the writing would have looked like at the time. Yes, I see that there's a question.
We're not seeing the manuscript.
Oh, I'm sorry. Huh. That is strange. I apologize about that.
Karma
I-
mind.
I see the
Let's
screen.
see. Do you see it?
I see it, yeah. Or as what are you not seeing, Emily?
Oh, I'm not seeing the manuscript. I'm not seeing the National Library website.
Oh, I
Huh.
see. I see.
Okay.
It's okay.
Here, you know what? Just one moment. Let's hear. I'm going
Yeah,
to see
you
if I
want to
can
click
get
on
you.
it. You want to click on
Here,
it.
I'm
the
going to see if I
Everybody
can get you
else-
to that.
is-
One second.
Is everybody else?
Excuse me. It's
Is
worth.
everybody else?
Here, I'm going to try. I'm going to try
Emily,
to
just one
reshare
second,
my
okay?
screen right now, and we'll see if that gets us. Hold on one second.
I think if you just click on that link.
yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Here, I'm going to here.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yes, I
Yes.
can.
Okay,
Emily,
great.
can you give
So
us a thumb
I
up?
apologize
Okay,
about that,
perfect.
but
Yeah,
hopefully everyone
sorry.
can see now. This is the National Library of Israel website, where again, one can look up many different manuscripts, but this manuscript that we have before us, as I started saying, is one of the most important, most significant manuscripts of Sefer Hasidim from around the year 1300. It's considered one of the most complete and one of the earliest versions of this text. This is what the manuscript looks like. You can zoom in to see it a little bit better over here like that. And it's a long manuscript with many different passages. Now, Sefer Hasidim is organized into individual discrete simanim, it's sometimes referred to, or kind of paragraphs. Those are the paragraphs that we're going to be taking a look at in just a few moments. And you can see how they begin over here. And they continue on, right? And if you take a look at this website afterwards on your own, excuse me, the wrong direction, you can see that the text goes on, and these larger words oftentimes indicate the beginning of a new paragraph. This is what it looks like. Okay, I'm going to stop this share and go back to my PowerPoint. Just one moment, please.
One quick question, Rachel.
Yes, please.
Is the letters are Hebrew, but is the language German, or what's the language?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that, because I meant to mention it myself and forgot. Sefer Hasidim is written in Hebrew. We're going to be seeing that as we take a look at some of the passages itself. That being said, it's a medieval rabbinic Hebrew, which means that it is definitely influenced by the local vernacular. And as a matter of fact, if we're already talking about language and the impact of the vernacular on Sefer Hasidim, again, the vernacular, which for most of the figures involved would have been medieval German, High Medieval German. Some scholars have questioned whether the very term Hasid of Sefer Hasidim was not, in fact, a translation of a local vernacular concept. Right? Because although the rabbinic scholars who wrote this text, Shmuel Hasid, Yehuda Hasid, Elazar of Worms, who we mentioned, they wrote in Hebrew, as did all rabbinic authors in Ashkenaz of the time. The language that they would have spoken at home with their peers would have been German, or some scholars would say some sort of Proto-Yiddish, that is a German inflected with Hebraisms, with Jewishisms, which some scholars consider to be early Yiddish, but in fact could also be considered just another version of medieval German. And so some scholars question whether the Hasidim, or the term Hasid of Sefer Hasidim, is perhaps a translation of the word Frum, or the later Yiddish frum, right? Which probably is the term that these people would have used in their local vernacular for the concept Hasid. Now we're going to come back to that idea, because in trying to pinpoint what we mean by Hasid, it will be helpful to consider what the vernacular term Frum, or Frömmigkeit, or later in later Yiddish, Frumkeit, as some of us might be more familiar hearing it pronounced, what that would have meant during this period in Ashkenaz. Right? What would that term have meant to a 13th century Jew in Regensburg? Right, that's an important question for trying to think about what the term Hasid denoted. But in any case, thank you for the language of this text is Hebrew, just to answer that question briefly. Thank you for asking that. Now, as I mentioned beforehand, excuse me, I just want to go back to my screen here. As I mentioned beforehand, Sefer Hasidim as a text is a little bit hard to pinpoint. There are different versions and different recensions. Today, when we refer to Sefer Hasidim, we usually refer to two different versions of Sefer, two primary versions of Sefer Hasidim. The one that you see here on the left, that's the sort of the opening page of the 1891 printing of Sefer Hasidim, edited by an individual named Yehuda Vistinetsky, which was based on that Parma manuscript that we just saw, right? Which, as I mentioned beforehand, is one of the most important medieval manuscripts, one of the most extensive versions. It contains one of the largest number of individual paragraphs of Sefer Hasidim. The edition that you see on the right hand of the screen here, which is the Mossad Harav Kook, it's actually a very new version of the Mossad Harav Kook edition that initially came out in 1957, edited by Reuven Margaliot. That edition of Sefer Hasidim was based on the first printed edition of Sefer Hasidim, which, as I mentioned beforehand, was done in Bologna in 1538. Now, there are some overlaps between these two versions, but they are distinct texts. In other words, some of the individual paragraphs appear in both versions of Sefer Hasidim, but the two versions are not identical to one another by any means. The Vistinetsky edition on the left-hand side is the longer one, as I mentioned. There are all kinds of theories, as you can imagine, that scholars have as to how and why these editions came out. I should mention that there are many other medieval and early modern manuscripts on which these editions also draw from and are based. We're going to leave a lot of that intense academic speculation on the side, but I do mention it because it's, of course, relevant to understanding what is this text that we are discussing, that we are looking at. Now, going back, before we jump into looking at some of the passages that I want to take a look at together today, I do want to make note of two very important works that in a sense bookend the question that I've posed for us, this question of who were the Hasidei Ashkenaz and what was Sefer Hasidim. Was it the product of a formal institutionalized movement of pietists who had a very particular vision of society that they promoted through this text amongst others? Or were these Hasidim, in fact, representatives of a much broader spectrum of the medieval Ashkenazi population, people who generally were motivated, who were drawn to engage in pious religious behaviors that in fact were not institutionalized, did not represent any particular movement, but in fact reflected much broader popular practice and belief. And the two books that you have in front of you, the one on the left hand by Ivan Marcus, who is a professor at Yale University in the United States, and the one on the right hand by Elisheva Baumgarten, a professor at Hebrew University in Israel, reflect in a sense those two different approaches. Marcus, now I do want to point out here that Marcus's book, Piety and Society, was published some time ago in 1981. Marcus himself has revised some of his positions, some of his approach and opinions on this matter, such that he too now believes that Hasidei Ashkenaz, if they existed, probably represented a very small elite group that did not have much influence as any sort of institutionalized movement. But in his earlier work, that was the idea that he promoted. He promoted this idea that for the Kalonamides, those authors that we mentioned, Sefer Hasidim was a vehicle for setting out a plan for how to create this pietistic society. Whereas Elisheva Baumgarten, in the book on the right-hand side and in many of her other writings, has promoted the idea that in fact there were no Hasidei Ashkenaz as such, but that in fact this text, which was authored again by a very, very small group of scholars, reflects a much broader approach that we can see in a whole range of different texts and different other kinds of writings and artifacts from the period that does in fact represent what medieval Ashkenazi Jewry, men, women, and the non-elite, as the title of her book suggests, were doing, were believing, and were embracing. Both of these authors, and this is going to be a theme that we're going to return to as well, also delve into not only the Jewish roots of these ideas and practices, but the way in which the local society, the contemporaneous society that is contemporaneous German Christian society, impacted, shaped, and interacted with Jewish ideas to really animate how medieval Ashkenazi people thought about piousness, thought about religion in general. And so we're going to be seeing a lot of that as well. But what I'd like to do now in the time that remains to us, in the about 20 minutes that we have left, is to take a look at Sefer Hasidim itself and to ask ourselves, based on a handful of passages that we'll see together now, what do these texts from Sefer Hasidim suggest a Hasid, a pious person, or perhaps a pietist, in fact, was? The first text that we're going to look at, and by the way, all of the texts that we're going to see right now happen to come from the Parma version of Sefer Hasidim. On other occasions, we'll have opportunity to look at the Bologna edition. The first text is perhaps the thickest or the most intense of them, so I ask you to bear with me. This is the opening passage of Sefer Hasidim, in which the author, or really, as we said, the authors, lay out their program for what they intend to do with this text. So it's a particularly relevant passage for us to take a look at if we want to know who a Hasid was for the authors and the Jews who stood behind Sefer Hasidim. I'm going to read the English, although you have the Hebrew above in the upper section of the screen as well. For those who fear God and are mindful of his name, do I write this book of remembrance, so that they may learn how to fear God. There is a Hasid, and again, note the term here, the use of the term, because that's what we're going to be questioning. There is a Hasid whose heart goes out to, in other words, who aspires to do the will of his creator. And here I want to mention the Hebrew term, which is ritzon habore, the will of his creator, the will of the creator. But he does not perform as many good deeds as the wise Hasid. For these demands were not passed on to him by his teacher, and he was not wise enough to infer them by himself. But had he known, he would have accepted and fulfilled them. For they, our sages, have said, and this is a quote from Tractate Berachot, a man must be cunning in the fear of the Lord. The term in Hebrew is arum biyirah, and that's also a term to underline that appears over and over again in Sefer Hasidim. Now, in case you didn't quite catch all of that, we're going to move on to the next screen. The passage continues. We find in the Torah that anyone who was capable of understanding a demand, even though he was not explicitly commanded, is punished for not realizing the requirement on his own. Right? So let's backtrack for just one moment. I'm going to flip back a screen. Right? The opening passage of Sefer Hasidim says this book is being written to teach people how to fear God. What does that mean? Right? A Hasid is supposed to infer certain commands, even though they have certain desires of the creator, even though they have not been explicitly commanded. Now, some people are intellectually incapable of inferring things that they have not been explicitly told. Those are Hasidim who want to do the will of their creator, but can't do it as completely as possible because they're incapable of inferring things that they have not explicitly been told. But the wise Hasid, who is set here on the pedestal, is the one who knows how, who can understand even things that he has not been told, who can understand the desire of the creator, the desire of God, the will of God, even though he has not explicitly been told it. And here's the example, right? I'm jumping now again to slide 2. And Moses was angry with the officers of the army. I'm starting on line 3 here, who had come from the service of the war. This is referring to the war that the Israelites conducted against the Midianites as they stood poised to enter the land of Israel. We're at the end of the book of Numbers, the book of Medival here. Why was Moses angry with these officers? He said to them, "Have you let all the women live?" When they did not, why did they not reply, "You did not command us, for you did not tell us to kill the women"? But Moses knew that they were wise and perspicacious enough to infer this command on their own. Right? So in other words, in that passage from Sefer Bamidbar, Moshe is reprimanding the officers of the army who didn't kill all of the Midianite women, even though they hadn't explicitly been commanded to do so. What gave him the right to reprimand them for not fulfilling something that they hadn't explicitly been commanded to do? He knew that they understood that the command was to get rid of everyone. It was total war against the Midianites. We won't go into the ethics of that right now. Here's another example that the author of Sefer Hasidim brings. Similarly, why did not Balaam, again, we're in the book of Bamidbar, why did not Balaam reply to the angel's question, "Why have you struck your ass?" by saying, "What sin was there in striking my ass, seeing she crushed my foot against the wall for no good reason? How have I sinned?" But he should have thought that perhaps God was opposed, for he only gave him permission to foretell the future. Similarly, Balaam said, "I have sinned, for I knew not that you stood in the way against me." But quite the contrary, the reverse conclusion should be drawn. Because he was unaware that the angel stood against him, he did not sin. But what he meant in saying, "I have sinned," was that I have sinned in that I did not give heed to think, I did not probe and investigate what other sin might have caused this. So in case you weren't following all of that, right? If you remember the story with Balaam, right? Balaam was riding on his donkey, going to, very much wanted to fulfill the request of the Midianite king to curse the Jews, to curse the Israelites, excuse me. But his donkey, who he was riding, kept pushing him to the side, kept straying from the road. And when Balaam did not actually see what the donkey saw, which was that there was an angel standing there blocking the way. But Balaam's response to God, "I have sinned," indicates that he knew what was going on. He knew what God wanted him to be doing, or more specifically, what God did not want him to be doing, even though he could have come up with an excuse because he did not actually see the angel. He was not actually commanded. Right? The point being, and I'm now getting to the end of the paragraph, from here we may infer that man must be cunning in the fear of God. Again, that arum b'yirah, since they punish him for his ignorance. For one must know and probe, for in the presence of the ruler you cannot acquit yourself by saying, "It was a sin committed out of ignorance." So I'm going to pause here. Again, as I said, this was the most intense of the passages that we're going to be dealing with today. But let me ask you, to the extent that you were following along, what does this opening passage of Sefer Hasidim suggest is the attribute, is the characteristic that a Hasid should be aspiring to? Who is a Hasid? What is a Hasid according to this passage from Sefer Hasidim? This opening passage from Sefer Hasidim, what does it mean to be a Hasid, a, again, pious or pietist individual?
he must be able to anticipate Ratzon Hashem, even if he's not given a specific directive. It's a kind
Okay,
of
so first of all, must want, must aim, must have as the ultimate goal in life to fulfill the will of the Creator. And then exactly as you said, needs to be wise and intuiting, can't be a blockhead, can't say, listen, I did exactly as I was told, right? A Hasid is someone who can intuit, can understand more than what he has actually been commanded.
But what comes across to me is this focus on sin, in that what should have, it would have been okay, but you sinned because you didn't intuit what the underlying command is, and the castigating of the not having this super sensitivity to what's behind the words.
Great. So thank you very much for noting that, because you're right that certainly this, as you say, this castigation for sinning, for not doing what one is supposed to be doing, is very much the tone that much of Sefer Hasidim takes. Again, it is a moralistic work. It is a work that aims to guide, to educate its readers to a particular way of behavior. And so, and that focus on sin is very much characteristic of the text. We're going to see that atonement is also a major theme of the text. But thank you for pointing out that, that focus on sinfulness. I want to move on now to a different passage from Sefer Hasidim, which I think provides another take, perhaps, on what Sefer Hasidim means when it refers to a Hasid. What is a Hasid for the writers of Sefer Hasidim? This is one of the most famous, I would say, passages from Sefer Hasidim that is oft quoted, and it touches upon a number of themes that we're going to be returning to in future weeks. It once happened that a Hasid used to sit on the ground among insects in the summer, and in the winter he would put his legs into a container filled with water until his legs became stuck in the ice, right? The water froze. His friend asked him, "Why do you do that? Is it not written for your lifeblood too, I will require a reckoning," right? We're responsible for our lives. V'shamartem me'od lenafshotechem, the Torah says it in various different ways. Why do you endanger your life in this manner? Why then do you jeopardize your own life? The Hasid said to him, "I myself have not sinned that much, but it is impossible that I have not committed minor sins. For these, I would not have to undergo such acts of suffering. But the Messiah suffers because of our sins, as it is said, but he was wounded because of our transgressions," a quote from Yeshayahu. "Also, the perfectly righteous bear suffering. I do not want anyone but me to suffer for any of my sins. In addition, I will do good for many others. When the righteous endure suffering, many benefit." So again, I want to ask the question, thinking about this passage, based on this passage, who is a Hasid, or what is a Hasid for the writers of this text?
sounds like a martyr.
Okay, sounds like a martyr. Now, I don't know if you meant this, but going back to one of the points that I raised beforehand, there's something kind of Christian sounding about what's going on here, right? For I think many people. Again, that's a theme that we're going to be coming back to, right? Sounds like a Hasid, like a pious individual, is a martyr from this text. What else?
He almost sounds Eov-like, in that he anticipates he might sin, or he could have sinned. He's something, so he's going to do something proactively.
Okay, so again, that focus, that you might even say obsession with sinning and sinfulness, and as I said beforehand, atonement for the sins. We're going to come back to all of these themes as well. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to move quickly on to the next passage, and you can just note these points for yourself as themes that we'll have to come back to in terms of understanding who exactly or what exactly was a Hasid. Here's another one. Once there was a Hasid who would not lie in his bed on the nights when his wife was a nidah, that is menstrually impure. Rather, he would sleep sitting or reclining in a chair. For he said, if I lie comfortably in my bed, I would sleep too well and perhaps I might have a nocturnal emission. Rather, I should sleep uncomfortably without a pillow so that I will not see an emission. Sometimes he would stand all night studying Torah. So who is a Hasid for this passage?
Well, this sounds like an ascetic. I mean,
An
that's
ascetic. Well, someone who's very concerned with issues of purity or impurity, rather. Someone who's particularly concerned about seminal emissions, right? Someone who's particularly concerned with issues of sexuality. And as I mentioned in the outset, that is definitely a major theme of Sefer Hasidim, as is the attitude of Sefer Hasidim's authors to women and gender. And I'll just mention here very briefly that all of these Hasidim that we have been seeing thus far are very clearly men, right? Here's the passage where it's unmistakable, right? But all of the Hasidim that we've encountered thus far in Sefer Hasidim are men, and that's not coincidental. Sefer Hasidim, on a few very occasional opportunities, does refer to Hasidot, but Sefer Hasidim on the whole refers to Hasidim as men. Now, that's not because Sefer Hasidim has nothing to say about women, but that is actually, again, a question that we're going to have to ask ourselves when we think about whether Sefer Hasidim was referring to a small elite group of institutionalized members, or whether Sefer Hasidim in fact reflects a much broader attitude and approach of the Ashkenazi Jews. If we look outside of Sefer Hasidim to, for example, epitaphs on gravestones from this era, we see that the concept Hasidah or Hasidut is applied very frequently to women as well, which again raises the question of what is Hasidut, who is or who was a Hasid for these authors, and to what extent did it reflect what was going on outside of the text. And we're going to, again, that's yet another theme that we're going to be coming back to. I want to take a look in our last 2 minutes at one final text, and then I'll try to pull these themes together. This is a text from, again, Sefer Hasidim, the Parma recension. Once there was a Hasid who requested that the king fine every Jew who took an oath 12 pennies. And the Hasid intended that this would lead Jews not to swear falsely, because in that city, Jews would take God's name in vain and swear falsely for matters that were not monetary ones. And the Hasid asked and received authority from the king concerning every Jew who took an oath, whether truthfully or falsely in non-monetary matters, in order to prevent them from swearing in vain. And the inhabitants of that city wanted to exile him, and they excommunicated him until he went and took his relatives and allies and went to a different city. And all those who excommunicated him and their descendants were struck. Some of them were killed, others were burned because he had meant well. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this text that we're obviously not going to do in the 2 minutes, but I do want to highlight here both the concern for taking God's name in vain, which is a theme that recurs in Sefer Hasidim. Some suggest that, in fact, part of what was concerned here was that perhaps the Jews would be swearing on Christian saints, which was also a matter that we know preoccupied medieval Ashkenazi Jews. But another theme that comes up here, and as far as defining who a Hasid was, is this friction between the Hasid and the other inhabitants, the other Jews, right? The Hasid is excommunicated, is exiled by the other Jews. And that friction between those identified as Hasidim, as pious ones, and the non-Hasidim, or ostensibly non-pious ones, is another theme that we're going to see repeats itself in Sefer Hasidim, and that we're going to need to question as far as understanding what is going on in this text and how does it in fact reflect the society that produced it. I'm going to pause here because our time is up, not because there is nothing more to be said about any of these things, but I'm going to leave these as teasers, which I hope you will return to explore with me in much greater depth in the coming weeks. So thank you very much for joining today, and I hope to see you again so that we can continue unpacking all of this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Furst, Rachel. And I just wanted to quickly answer a question from Emily. Yes, it is. The recording will be available after class, and anyone else that wants to review and listen again. Rachel, would you like to take a couple questions, or would you like to close?
Sure, with pleasure. And I also wanted to reiterate that I will make these slides available so that you'll have the text. You'll be able to review the text if you want to do so as well.
Wonderful.
Yes, but if anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
Yeah, we can. Oh, there you go. Ruth, do you have a question?
Yes. So Rachel, this whole presentation so far, it sounds uncomfortably like the Essenes, and also going back to the Second Temple times towards the end, when there was all that friction about Tuma and Tara, and the splitting of the people into two sects. People wouldn't talk to each other. People wouldn't go into their houses. They wouldn't socialize with each other because they were so obsessed with this Tuma Tara stuff. So it sounds like they just kept on doing this? It's like a theme through Jewish history. I don't know.
Well, certainly, two Jews, three opinions is, I would say, a theme throughout Jewish history. So the fact that there were different opinions about all of these matters, the fact that there were friction between different groups, that is probably not surprising. But you're right to highlight some of these issues. Some of the topics perhaps sound familiar. We'll have to come back to those and ask to what extent they really reflect something unique about this particular society. But the other way that I want to answer that question is to again reiterate that one of the questions we'll have to keep asking ourselves is whether this ostensible divide between the Hasidim and the non-Hasidim that sometimes gets expressed in Sefer Hasidim as per the passage that we just saw really reflects a lived reality in medieval Ashkenaz. And we're obviously going to have to try and answer that question by looking at some texts outside of Sefer Hasidim to try and get a perspective that's broader than this one particular work itself.
What's striking to me is this sense of chumrah, of setting limits to prevent your natural inclinations or tendencies and to avoid sin to quite an extreme. And so there's such an emphasis on prevention, and because of what you might inevitably do. I think that's what it means by arum b'yira, that you almost have to fight your inclinations and prevent sin.
Yeah, and again, thank you for once again highlighting that theme of that concern for sinfulness that definitely pervades Sefer Hasidim. We're going to be seeing that over and over again. But I think the other thing that you pointed out just now, this idea of sort of some sort of supererogatory piety, this idea of going lifnim mishurat hadin, as the Talmud would have it, of going beyond the letter of the law, but particularly, as you said, in the way of setting up these fences or setting up these boundaries to avoid the very possibility of sin is going to be a theme that we're going to see cut across many of the different passages. So we'll return to that definitely. Yes, you're right to take note of that here.
Okay, thank you so much again, Rachel, and thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. Wonderful class. I'm looking forward to seeing you at more classes here at Drisha. As always, all of our classes are listed on our website, drisha.org. And for now, lehitraot.
Thank you.
Yeah.